right. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Information Thought Series. The Reparation Information Thought Series is a periodic strategic webinar featuring reparations experts, racial justice leaders, and you engaged in critical discussion, reflection, and analysis on issues pertinent to the movement for reparatory justice in the United States and abroad, co-hosted by the Reparation Education Project and the National Black Cultural Information Trust. Today's topic is Reparations Rising, California's Next Steps. I am your host, Jessica Ann Mitchell Aiwuyor, founder of the National Black Cultural Information Trust, and our other host, Nkechi Taifa, the founder of the Reparation Education Project. Joining us today is Dr. Cheryl Grills, professor of psychology at Loyola Marymount University and also former California Reparations Task Force member. We're also joined by Lisa Holder, president of the Equal Justice Society, attorney, and former California Reparations Task Force member. Also, we're joined by Dr. Don Tamaki, senior counsel at Minami Tamaki LLP, former California Reparations Task Force member as well. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
So before we jump into the... Okay, great. Before we jump into the first question, because I know there's so much people want to learn about what's going on in California, just to let you all know that you can put questions in the Q&A. And we already have a slew of questions. We'll probably answer your questions along the way, but if we don't, put them in the Q&A.
I say thank you, JM, Jessica Ann Mitchell Aiwuyor with the National Black Cultural Information Trust for introducing this Reparation Information Thought Series and our esteemed guest panelists today. So I just want to pose the first question to our panelists. You are all part of a collaborative organization called the Alliance for Reparations, Reconciliation, and Truth. Just let our listening audience know just how this came to be and how you all work together to advance reparations in the state of California. Who would like to go in and start with just that?
I can give just the factual background on the background, and then I would give it to Lisa, who co-chairs the movement itself, but just for background purposes, if that would be all right. So basically, the 2-year endeavor of the task force ended on June 29, 2023. And after 27 days of 2 years of work, 27 days of hearing, 48 hours of testimony from expert and lay witnesses, the task force itself presented a groundbreaking 1,100-page final report, drawing a through line from 246 years of enslavement, another 90 years plus of Jim Crow exclusion and racial terror, and decades more of continuing discrimination leading to today's outcomes, for which the task force recommended over 115 recommendations for repair. And then the legislation that authorized the task force ended, so we sunsetted. And I think there was a general realization that the last 2 years of really intense work wouldn't matter. And by that, I mean, just on the final report itself, there were probably 130 people involved in that, including university professors, 30 Department of Justice lawyers, and just huge numbers of staff devoted to this groundbreaking effort that had never been done before. But the question was, what do you do? What would we do next? And so 6 of the 9 task force members had come together, along with 5, leading organizations in this area. Equal Justice Society, which Lisa Holder leads, California Black Power Network, Live Free, Catalyst, California Black Equity Collective, that provide the core leadership. And then under that is about 20 or so multiracial organizations forming a steering committee to further inform and work with the core group. And the areas are divided into policy and, moving the needle of public opinion. And with respect to the policy issues, that means looking at the 115 recommendations, sort of sorting through them and communicating with legislators about which ones would be to move reparations forward. And the other part is educating the public about reparations. So that's and doing it on a statewide basis. And of course, we hope whatever is developed in California, spreads to the rest of the country. So that's just a quick overview of art and where we are now. And maybe Lisa can fill in the gaps.
Happy to elaborate on that important foundation that Don Tamaki just outlined. So ARRT, ART, stands for the Alliance for Reparations, Reconciliation, and Truth. We've been in operation now, I believe, since about March of 2024, so a little bit more than 6 months. And as Don outlined for us, we have over 30 civil rights organizations who are part of the coalition. And that's exclusive of all the advisors from around the country who are active in civil rights, who are also advising the coalition. So what's most important to know about art? What's most important? You should find out about us. You should go on to ART's website, the Alliance for Reparations, Reconciliation, and Truth. All of us in the coalition are very much dedicated and committed to repairing the harm of slavery, Jim Crow, and post-civil rights discrimination. So every group that has signed on to ART was, prior to even working with ART, they were committed to the values of truth and repair. And now that they are part of ART, we are much more intentional about moving the needle forward on repairing the harm and reparations, Black reparations, particularly. Very intentional about recognizing that the terrible outcomes that we're seeing today that are having such a disproportionate impact on Black folks actually stem from and have a root cause embedded in slavery, Jim Crow discrimination, and post-civil rights apartheid policies. You follow that through line from 400 years, and you get to the disparate and disproportionate terrible outcomes that we're seeing for Black folks in every walk of life, whether it's housing, education, access to home ownership, our criminal legal system. Within all of those systems where we're seeing Black people catching hell, it all stems from the anti-Black narrative that is part of the racial pathology of this country that began in 1619. And so the work of art is to repair the harm. And when we say repair the harm, we're talking about in terms of policy and legislation, so pushing forward and educating the public about those 115 policy recommendations, essentially bills that the California Task Force created in this Book of Truth, right? This is the California Reparations Report. So educating the public about all of those bills that we're trying to push forward to repair the harm in all of those sectors that I identified. But the other really important thing about art is that we are not just committed to check in the mail policies. We are committed to policies that repair systems that were originally created to do harm to Black folks. Now we want to retool and rehabilitate all of those systems so that they are centering Black folks and repairing all of those generations and decades of harm that they had previously done. The other thing that's really critical to know about art is that not only are we're committed to creating these policies that repair the harm to Black folks, we are committed to repairing the narrative. You cannot legislate your way out of 400 years of anti-Black racism and anti-Black animus and anti-Black policy. You can't just legislate your way out of it. You have to repair the narrative. We have to repair America's psychology when it comes to the way that they view Black folks, the way that they perceive Black folks, and their understanding of our contributions to the fabric of American society. And that is a narrative building, narrative shifting effort that art is also committed to, and that we are utilizing innovative communications, social media tools to start to repair that narrative. And the last thing I'll say, it's much more practical. You know, in California, we are many years ahead of many other municipalities and localities and states that are doing this work. You know, we got a jumpstart, and we were able to help create the blueprint for doing reparations, certainly at the state level. Of the 115 bills that we recommended as a task force already in the last state legislative session, 14 of those bills went through the legislative process, and 10 of those bills were adopted into law. That is critical. You know, in California, we are doing reparations. We already have 10 laws that are based on the Reparations Task Force recommendation to repair the harm to Black folks. So this is an uphill battle, and we are steadily climbing that hill and creating a blueprint for the nation. And over the next 5 years, you're going to see that those other 100 bills that we outlined in the task force, you're going to see those moving through the California reparations through the legislative process, and you're going to see reparations, a full spate of reparations laws in California over the next 5 years. I'll pass it to Dr. Grills because she always has the most enlightening thing to say, so we leave her for the end.
I'll just add one quick little snippet to what my colleagues have already shared. And so, you know, art is really committed to educating the public as a way to change that narrative, as Lisa was talking about. And, you know, when people think of reparations, they think about, oh, well, this is something to fix something for Black folk. Right? But it's really something bigger than that as well. And we need to always keep an eye on that. So we are committed in art to forming solidarity across different constituencies to join us in this fight for reparations and healing. And healing through reparations benefits more than just Black folks. It benefits the state of California. It supports and provides healing for an entire American society. And as a good friend of mine, Dr. Jaya John said, he says, you don't heal a tumor in the body for the sake of the tumor. You heal it for the sake of the body. So we can't just fix and address that tumor, that cancerous tumor of racism and how it's impacted Black folk. It's got to do something to heal that entire body. Otherwise, the cancer grows back. So ultimately, reparations, as we see it, is a fight for the very humanity of California and the country. And it reveals something about who we are. Do we as a society care enough about our collective existence that we are willing to invest in repairing harm for the harmed among us? Truly, what is the measure of our character as a society?
Thank you so much, everyone. You all actually went into the second and third question a bit, but still going to ask just in case you want to add anything else. So, and I just put this in the chat, but there were multiple reparations bills that have passed through the legislature in California. Can you tell us more about the California Legislative Black Caucus's 14 reparations bills that they were moving forward with and how they align with the California Reparations Task Force's final report that you just lifted up, Lisa?
So I could start if that's
Okay.
okay. Yeah. So I think first it's important to know that ART believes that reparations should bring about transformative, systemic, and longstanding policy solutions that change the lives of Black Californians, not just in the current moment, but in perpetuity, because we have seen too many examples of efforts to bring about some kind of remediation or addressing the harms done to Black folk. We got all kinds of legislations, we got all kinds of programs, et cetera, et cetera. And they seem to hold promise for a minute, but then they're usually followed by some kind of backlash that in some instances puts us further back than where we were before that thing was implemented. So we look at policy solutions that are coming out of the California legislature with an eye of to what extent do they address the five areas of or principles identified by the United Nations as demonstrative of real reparations, right? So to what extent are the bills aligned with United Nations principles? And when we look at what the California Legislative Black Caucus came up with, there's some disagreement among the caucus members about whether to go all in now or to take kind of an incremental approach. And what we saw was a little bit of both. Individual members were bringing bills that maybe went further than some of the other bills. Overall, the legislative package tried to make an impact while understanding some very real things, right? The political and economic environment. We aren't operating in a vacuum, and we got to be adults about this and understand the context within which we're trying to bring forth reparations. So in 2024 environment, what are we dealing with right now when these bills were rolling out? An election year, a budget deficit in the state, and the need to build more political will and support. So, I think that the caucus was trying to understand and work with that current environment. The other thing that I think is important is that it took us 400 plus years to get here. A single legislative session is not going to address that. We got to be more sophisticated in our thinking and our understanding about these things. Reparations, the fight for reparations was always a multi-year strategy, right? To pass what was 115 recommendations for repair in our final task force report, which actually had subcomponents, which if you break those out, we're looking at 330 steps or measures that needed to be taken, 330 pieces of legislation. So, how does one begin to roll that out? And so, in terms of where ART stood with respect to the bills that did come out, we used some very basic criteria. Does it align with the UN principles? Restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. Do the bills actually reflect some of the recommendations in the task force report? Would the bill actually reflect impact that's concrete, that's measurable, that's enforceable, and that's permanent? And so when we look at the bills, ART actually supported 8 of the 14 bills using that criteria or framework, and we remain neutral on some others where it was not clear that the bill was going to be able to meet up with those particular standards, or there were questions about really what would it take to implement that particular bill. I'll stop and let my colleagues chime in here.
I'll add a couple things. The one noteworthy item is that this is a very bad budget year for California. California, the way it funds the state, the budget ebbs and flows. And some years have been huge surpluses, and other years have been severe deficits. This year there's a $41 billion deficit. So I think that also impacted the way the California Legislative Black Caucus, the 12 Black members of the legislature, approached this year. Also impacting it was an election year. But notwithstanding that, a number of bills did make it through the process. I want to add one thing. They're waiting for the governor's signature or veto. So that's obviously a relevant matter. But I'll just kind of list them that went through. There's a $12 million budget line item unallocated to deal with reparations, not in the sense that 12 million is going to be meaningful compensation in any way, but rather 12 million is to be set aside to be devoted to figure out, what is the next step. So it is a small amount, but it's not an insignificant amount. There's a couple of apology bills that have gone through, which memorialize for all time, California's role in the harm. And Californians kind of view their state as being an enlightened state and not realizing how deeply committed to Jim Crow California was and how complicit the state was in supporting enslavement in the other states. And that, is a recognition of the harm. I could say going through the Japanese American redress and reparations process, how important that public acknowledgement is, because it opened the door to inform the public and create a marker for all time that what happened should not be repeated. I'm speaking of, herding over 125,000 Americans into concentration camps for no good reason. So I think the apology is a first for California, and it's significant in that respect because it's something to build on. Another bill that had gone through was the, allowing a legal right of action for racially motivated takings. And eminent domain was a legal tool that local governments use, municipalities, to condemn and expropriate Black-owned property and Black-owned businesses. And there were between late 1940s and right into the 1970s, there were 2,532 eminent domain projects in 992 cities, resulting in 1 million people losing their homes and being displaced, 2/3 of whom were Black. And California was no exception throughout the state of this racially motivated taking. They called it urban renewal. James Baldwin, the author, called it Negro removal. And so this bill sets up a process wherein the Office of Legal Affairs will analyze what can be done about it and who was victimized by it, and will significantly give the victims that lost property a legal right of action. Ordinarily, these kind of things might be barred by the statute of limitations being too late or not authorized. And so this is sort of opens this issue of people that lost properties by freeways and upscale developments, the location of polluting industries and so on, which benefited entire regions, enhanced the value and the productivity of entire regions, but were built and run through Black neighborhoods. So we thought that was a significant move forward. Another bill includes hairstyles and Black, hairstyles by Black students in particular, to be included among the characteristics that would be protected status, and and allow the prevention of that, but also legal action to the extent that, along with other indices of discrimination, whether it's race or gender or religion or disability, to also include hairstyle, because that's been a source of all kinds of problems, including school discipline and sports. So we thought also that was significant. ACA 8 will now be on the ballot, which prohibits slavery in any form. And so, as people I'm sure on this conference realize, slavery is prohibited in the United States except in incarceration. And we had plenty of testimony during the 2 years that we had of people incarcerated, but forced to work, including when the COVID outbreak happened and people didn't know how it was transmitted and people were dying, and before the invention and deployment of vaccines, tasked to clean up the cells of others who had been infected. And if they didn't, punishment would follow. And of course, in the usual setting, this is all without reasonable compensation of any kind. So that was another bill that we're happy that got through, and it's to shine a light on what that goes on and also educate the public that this sort of involuntary servitude still persists. I'll turn it over to Lisa. Maybe she has some comments.
No, thanks for the specificity on the bills. I know that's a really important question. I know that a lot of the media coverage has sort of distorted this process, so it's really important to have this public education process where people actually drill down and see what bills are being passed in California. But I just want to make a larger thematic point. The way that I see the process that we're engaging in California is really as something innovative, something historic. Because frankly, for 170 years since emancipation, Black people have been fighting for reparations. And there have been many, many iterations of that battle. And now, really, for the first time in history, a state is doing reparations and embedding a reparatory justice framework into the laws. And so the way I see it is that, these bills that are being outlined, this time it was 10 bills that got passed. Next year, it may be 15. The year after, it may be 20. This is one small step for California, but it's one giant leap within the context of our American history.
So thank you so very much, all of you all, and especially for going into detail with respect to some of these bills that did in fact pass through, and for giving a broader thematic vision to it. In fact, Lisa Holder, I liked it when you earlier talked about the fact that you cannot just legislate out over 400 years, that we have to do is repair the narrative. And that's what we're seeking to do now with these Reparation Information Thought Series. So one of the major stories this legislative session was concerning two bills that were not advanced by the California Legislative Black Caucus. One bill was concerning a reparations fund, and the other was concerning a Freedmen's Bureau. Do you think reparations have been stalled since these bills have not advanced forward? Have you considered any alternative measures? And just basically, what are your general thoughts about this, which has generated so much conversation in the media?
Well, I can go ahead and start on this one. So these two bills, quote unquote, failed. I think it is unfair. Some of the comments that came out subsequently, that reparations in California therefore have failed is an accurate statement. And in terms of the bills themselves, ART actually supported SB 1331. It was one of our priorities. In fact, one of the task force members and an ART member, Don, was the primary witness for the bill as it moved through the Senate. And we submitted numerous letters that are on record for that bill. We weren't happy that it failed, and think that there's a need for there to be some continued advocacy for ongoing funding for reparations. $12 million is not enough, and definitely more needs to be done on that front. So there are opportunities, and there will be, I'm sure, opportunities to bring the bill back, especially in a better fiscal environment, right? We also need to talk about progressive revenue streams, especially when you have big, wealthy corporations who benefited directly and indirectly from the enslavement of Black folk. So I think there's much more to be done on 1331. Now, in terms of well, maybe I should stop there and let Don and Lisa, if they want to chime in on that one before.
Just to let everybody know what 1331 was. It was a bill by Senator Bradford to set aside 6% of the state's budget reserve for reparations. And the 6% was derived from the fact that Black Californians are about 6%. And so I did speak in behalf of that in one of the committees. We did support it. It didn't go through, but we don't see that as stalling reparations. And we feel that the California Legislative Black Caucus has made a commitment to, planning is already going ahead for the 2025 legislative session. So it's just one of those things that it's just part of the process. Some bills will make it, some bills won't. But the idea that reparations is going to be one and done is, this is an issue, obviously, where the harm was centuries in the making. So the repairs have to be long and consistent in the implementation. And we're just starting this process. So, and we're doing this for the first time. That's another thing that during a very bad budget year. So I think those things should be kept in mind when assessing, whether the effort is moving forward or has been stalled. And again, I don't think it's stalled at all.
Mm-hmm. And then I think I'm sorry, Lisa, did you want to say anything else about that one? Okay. I think in terms of the California American Freedmen's Affairs Agency, the CAFA bill, yes, there needs to be an infrastructure and oversight when it comes to implementing reparations, particularly to protect and respect the intent and spirit and scale and scope of reparations efforts. So that, that Freedmen's Affairs Agency bill would have begun to set up some kind of infrastructure. ART remained neutral on that, for a few reasons, including things like, there's some unanswered questions about this agency. We don't want to leave reparations open to people who, should not be receiving reparations. We also don't want to erect barriers for people who do want to and deserve to receive reparations. And I'm talking at this moment about special populations like folks who are formerly or currently incarcerated, our children in the child welfare system and the child probation system, et cetera. So we wanted assurances that this bill would not disproportionately impact these populations, and those protections were not clear. And then in terms of the agency scope and independence, if there's going to be such an agency, it does need to be independently owned and operated for and by Black folk, and not able to be used as a potential weapon against our people by an unfriendly administration or the changing of political winds, that does happen, or the interpretation of administrators who don't have a particular position, perspective, sentiment that understands and respects reparations. And then just in general, there's some things to be understood and specified about the creation of such an agency in terms of, how much would it cost to set this thing up and run it? And will that be potentially detracting money that could be going to implementation of reparations efforts? How long would it take to set this thing up? For those of us who understand state bureaucracy, California state bureaucracy, and agencies within the government, this is no minor thing. And it's rife with rules and regulations that would have to be established, et cetera, et cetera. And then it would have to be staffed. So, just a lot of unanswered questions. There is one thing I want to say about the kind of media coverage of this bill not getting airtime, if you will. Some folks suggest, and the media to some extent suggested, that if there was not such an agency, that all other reparations bills couldn't be implemented. And I'm not sure that that is a fully accurate statement, that, that an agency would be the gateway to all other reparations. It's not necessarily a precondition for every reparations bill that would be put forth and passed. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, just with respect to both of the bills, I always like to pull back and do the sort of macro level bird's eye view of what's happening. In this session, just really immediately after the task force sunsetted and produced this historic report, immediately the Black Caucus took up 14 of the 115 bills, right? That was an immediate step. And we know that 10 of those bills went through and got passed and became law in California. So right now we can extrapolate from this experience and know that maybe 5-6 years from now, 70% of the 115 bills that the task force recommended got passed and became embedded into the California law. And that is significant. That is if that is the worst case scenario in our future, that's a pretty good scenario. That 70% of what we asked for to repair the harm is being executed. And I anticipate that as this movement builds momentum, as more people become aware, as ART continues to do public education of legislators and the body politic, it's going to become a much higher percentage. We're going to be looking at more like 85-90% of the bills that the task force recommended getting passed and embedded into California's laws. So I strenuously and aggressively push back on this silly narrative that we're seeing in the media, that because 2 bills didn't pass, reparations is not happening in California. That's entirely inaccurate. It's what we call disinformation and misinformation. And it's a narrative that needs to be put to pasture, because it's going to undermine the momentum in the movement nationally.
Could I say something also about the 3 apology bills? Since we're talking about the bills, because there's been, there's some folks who don't necessarily see the value or benefit of apologies or the apology bill. And through a formal acknowledgement of and an apology for the state of California's role in forced human enslavement, the bills actually affirms the state's guarantee of remediation and non-repetition, and provides permanent public access to the apology, and on the complex of the state capitol. But why is a bill, for example, like AB 3089 important? First, Chapter 16 of the 1,100-page report explicitly recommends that the legislature formally apologize on its own behalf and on behalf of the state for all the harms delineated. And while there's no magic bullet reparations remedy to repair the harm caused by California's role in chattel enslavement and all of its legacies, the passage of a bill like 3089 would represent a significant first step in a journey to tell the truth, to educate our citizens, and to create the groundwork for a much needed pathway for racial healing. But secondly, that kind of bill like 3089 satisfies elements of the 5 necessary principles for reparations as put forth by the UN. And so the bill would solidify both the sincerity and the integrity of what's a groundbreaking process still to this day undertaken by the state of California. Finally, apologies matter, and I'm talking as a psychologist. They matter symbolically and practically. Symbolically, an apology concedes that something actually happened that warrants a response. That is important. That has practical implications. It aligns and opens, it aligns with and opens the way for healing and reconciliation. And what folks may not realize is that in August of 2024, this year, the American Psychological Association passed its first ever resolution on reparations and restitution to address the interpersonal, the collective, and intergenerational trauma that happens under the weight of things like enslavement and post-enslavement anti-Black activity, processes, policies, et cetera. And they said that, you know, part of the work that needs to happen is the work of healing, and that there's enough psychological science out there to say that that's important. Well, we know in psychology and clinical psychology that when a harm has happened, the victim actually is responsive to an apology and an acknowledgement that they were wronged and harmed. And APA was not the only one. Prior to APA, the Association of Black Psychologists, the Asian American Psychological Association, and the Latinx Psychological Association all registered their support for the need for reparations in our state. And a formal apology in the form of the bills that were put forward aligns actually with the best thinking in psychological science and intergroup race relations with the capacity for practical impact. So we've got a public that is woefully undereducated, ignorant of what is reparations and why it's necessary, but it hasn't stopped people from registering an opinion, uninformed. And so an apology begins to force the conversation because it acknowledges something happened. And so what did happen? Oh, I did not understand or realize that. And whoa, it's still having effect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And just to underscore that point, you have to understand that California now has an apology embedded in the halls of legislation, right? That's going to be written, that's going to be there for everyone to see, talking about the harms that it has done to Black people in this state. Put that in the context of what is happening in this country. There are now over 50% of our states now have anti-CRT legislation that say you cannot talk about slavery, you cannot talk about Jim Crow because it harms white people, all right? So that's what's happening in the country, right? And so we're seeing an incredible pushback on that anti-CRT practice and policy and narrative in the state of California with these apology bills.
Thank you so much. We are going into our last few questions before Q&A. So if we could just get like 1 or 2 answers to the next few questions so we can make sure we can answer some of the questions in the Q&A. How are activists working together to build and gain political will to make sure that reparations continue to advance in California? I know that like the Alliance has its own coalition within that and on the wider spectrum.
So I think with art, there are 6 basic strategies that we are employing. One is community organizing and community engagement. So for example, California Black Power Network, one of the core partners in the Alliance, just hosted a virtual town hall, and folks can actually go and view that online. It was on Instagram. And we're doing things like get out the vote for yes on Prop 6 and no on Prop 36. So there's a lot of community engagement, a lot of community organizing. There is a legislative strategy. We're preparing for the 2025 cycle and beyond. We've taken all of the bills that were, all the recommendations made by the task force and started kind of putting them into buckets of that, where the idea, the strategy kind of aligns, and then looking at what are the priorities, and then how can we, support an effort to prioritize some of these bills. We're doing public education, narrative development, and messaging. And then that's a 3rd strategy. A 4th strategy is media engagement. We've been doing interviews with reporters and educating outlets to cover reparations in a less reactive way, in less harmful ways, in ways that reflect, do your due diligence. If you hear this, do some fact finding. What's the truth about this? What are alternative perspectives? 5th is the legal defense, building legal defense strategies, both in state and across the country, to defend the work of reparations. And then ally organizing. We can't do this alone. We have to have a strong and informed and mobilized ally base. So we're doing things like getting endorsements across sectors, across racial groups of the reparations effort, engaging non-Black communities and allies to support the work. We are building out a steering committee and an advisory council to help with the work. So that's some of the ways in which we are engaging the activists that are out there, doing what we're doing today. There was a lot of confusion right after the bills, were decided, and a lot of dis and misinformation. And so how do we kind of present a broader perspective or an alternative to some of the perspectives that were out there, but that the other alternative perspectives were never sought out by the media?
And thank you so very much, Dr. Grills. That was a very comprehensive answer. The last 2 questions, I'm going to kind of weld them both together and see who wants to respond. And it's about impact, even in terms of this particular thought series webinar. There were over 180 registrants, and 3/4 of those folks actually showed up. So this is definitely an issue that has an impact not only in California but across the country. So I want to ask you, what has been the impact of the reparations movement in California on the local community as well as nationally? What are your next steps? And just how can people be supportive of the work that you're doing as a collective and in your respective organizations as well? So that kind of was a potpourri mixing of the last 2 questions before we open it up to Q&A. The impact of the reparations movement in California on the local community and nationally, your next steps, and how can people be supportive of the work that you're doing? Who wants to tackle that or start tackling it?
How about Lisa?
All right, Lisa. Got it.
Thanks, Don Tamaki.
Yes.
We actually really like each other on camera. Well, the first thing is for people to educate themselves about reparations, about reparatory justice, about this repairing the harm framework, right? And that means watching more than one TikTok video. Doing some educating yourself about the history of the reparations movement, so people understand how long it is and how arduous a battle it's been, and so they can put these small wins into the broader context and really understand how historically significant they are. So that that education piece at a personal level is going to be very important. And ART, the Alliance, is doing what we can, as I said, to do really comprehensive public education and going out there, doing a lot of media, doing a lot of creative social media to bring younger youth into the movement, etc. So that's the education piece. The other thing is, if you feel inclined, if you feel compelled by this issue, if it resonates with you, you can be a part of the work that we're doing in ART. You can look up ARRT and go onto our website and figure out ways to plug in, figure out the different bills that we are endorsing and advancing, and figuring out how to become part of some of the sub campaigns, like the support for Proposition 6 and the defense against Proposition 36. So get involved, take an active step. The whole thing about this reparations paradigm, this repairing the harm framework, is not inactive. We have been passive and inactive and plugged out for way too long. Reparations it's this really important thought paradigm. It's an umbrella for everything that has to do with repairing this disease of anti-Black animus and the racial pathology in this country, right? So that's a really important intellectual paradigm, but it is also a paradigm of action. Right. And when you see the folks who have involved, folks like, like the godmother of this thing, like Nkechi, how active they are. People like, people going back to Marcus Garvey, Callie House, all of our icons in the reparations movement. Charles Ogletree, who was one of the founders of the Equal Justice Society, the organization that I run, they were so active, and they are so active in living this paradigm of reparations. Right? Living this paradigm, using it as a catalyst for the way that they act within the world. So be active, take steps, find out what ART is doing, and involve yourself. As far as the Equal Justice Society, as I said, we were founded by reparationists like Charles Ogletree, incredible civil rights icons like Eva Patterson, and we need support. I mean, we are leading this fight for reparations in California. We are one of the co-conveners of ART. Obviously, we were very involved through my work on the task force to create the blueprint for reparations that I believe now is becoming a national blueprint. So support organizations like the Equal Justice Society, like the California Black Power Network, who have co-convened ART by, either finding out about us online and donating to the repairing the harm work that we're doing, volunteering, giving your volunteer hours to work on this repairing the harm and reparations work, and being actively involved in our websites and the work that we are doing. So, for instance, Equal Justice Society, we have several newsletters that we distribute to our constituents, like, This Week in White Supremacy, which really talks about this important narrative transformational work that we're doing through reparations, which is dismantling white supremacy. Let's face it, that's what this work is. That's the narrative part. So support the work that Equal Justice Society, that the California Black Power Network is doing through donations, volunteer, or through educating yourself about our work, and then coming to the table, ready to pull up your sleeves and do something. Because until we all get into this fight, none of us are going to be successful.
Can I add one thing specifically addressing folks in the audience who are not Black, and the racial pathology that Lisa talked about? And the reality is, and the final report reveals this, is basically once you can dehumanize an entire population, as what has happened to Black people, then attacking and dehumanizing, diminishing any other group is easy. And so, although Black animus began in 1619 and propped up the institution of slavery, at some point it's impacted, of course, many other marginalized groups. So when the governor had asked me, why do you support Black reparations? My answer was kind of personal, and that was, it's a debt because a debt is owed. The country owes a debt to all the wealth extracted from the institution of slavery and how profitable it was to separate, segregate, apartheid in the next century and a half that followed. The other piece of it is the debt is owed because Black activists forced the country to be more faithful to its declared ideals. And then for people of color who are not Black, for other marginalized groups, Black activists, Black leadership really smashed through the doors of Jim Crow and opened up new opportunities, but everybody else walked through it. Asian Americans, women, name the groups. There's a debt that's owed. For Japanese Americans specifically, debt is owed to Black leaders who spoke out and answered our plea for help to support reparations for Japanese Americans, when it would have been far easier and logical, frankly, for them to turn a blind eye to our request and just say, what about us? And so I think for the other folks who are not Black, we have to get in this fight. And so part of ART's effort is to bring them in, and demographically, 6% of California's population is Black, 14% of the nation. Unless we cross racial lines on this and get the mass in the middle involved, it's going to be very hard to, as Dr. Grills has said, create the political will to change the landscape. That said, reparations is being discussed more than any other time in my lifetime, and I'm the oldest guy on this call. So I think it is happening, and I think the test case is California, but I think there's high potential for it to spread to other states and hopefully Washington, D.C., where the ultimate answer has to be federally. I'll stop here and just thank you for convening this program, Nkechi and Jessica.
Thank you so much. We are going to go right into Q&A. And we kind of touched on this, how California is impacting the nation. We have a question. What advice, tools, techniques would you give to organizations working on reparatory justice in conservative states like Oklahoma, Mississippi, Alabama, etc.?
So I think part of the work starts with basic community organizing to build a groundswell of like-minded folks who are well educated about reparations and the harms, and that are willing to roll up their sleeves and do the work of promoting recommendations, not just with the elected officials, but with communities writ large. I think the second thing is to help people who do not see themselves in reparations. And I'm not talking about see themselves as part of the problem or the descendants of the harmers, as much as how does reparations actually benefit the quality of life and the functioning of the broader society in those locales. I think people also need to be educated, that there needs to be a whole campaign to help folks understand that reparations is not just about a cash check, that reparations is about addressing some specific harms that happened during and post enslavement. And that post enslavement part, people need to see how the dots are connected. And then I think it's also doing the legwork of finding folks within their local legislatures who, with the benefit of information, can be champions of the work. And then I would say learn the lessons from folks who are in seemingly more progressive locations. California was perceived as this particularly progressive space. I think our report shows that that's not the case, that California was really, really complicit in a lot of harms. And so there's still something to be learned then from what we did, what folks in Evanston did, what folks in other parts of the country have done, and carry those lessons forward in their own strategies.
Anyone else like to answer?
I just have a couple of sort of practical things that people can do. In many ways, we in California were really maverick and groundbreaking because, the effort that the state made to make the case for reparations by convening the California Reparations Task Force was a genuine effort. And it wasn't performative, at least not the way that this task force did the work. Was not performative. It was real. We came out with a real product, and the product had a lot of resources in terms of money and human resources behind it. So we came up with a substantial product, and I lifted up that 1,100-page report. But when we constructed that report, we did it in a way so that it is easily replicable across the nation. We figured we have all these resources in California. Let's do the report that the federal government should have done through HR 40. And that's how we saw this process. And so our report is really national in scope. You think about it almost like an upside down pyramid. It's national in scope, and then we drill down to the harms. We look at the harms that have happened nationally over the last 400 years since 1619, and then we drill down with more specificity as to what happened in California, and drill down even further as to what steps the California legislature needs to take to now undo the harm. But the bulk of the report, 500 pages of this 1,100-page report, is about American history and the oppression of people in the African diaspora. And so that part is available to people doing this work across the country to use as sort of a scholarly foundation for the more detailed reparations legislation that they want to execute and undertake. So utilize a report like this. Also utilize other resources. There's a plethora of activity around reparations, and so there's artist collectives that are doing traveling art shows about reparations. Zeal, for instance, is one of those artist collectives. You can use those resources. You can call on those resources. Marshal the resources that already exist. There are a bunch of podcasts that are about reparations. Use that for your public education campaigns. And there's a tremendous amount of material now on social media, including an incredible video that Nkechi did, that 6-minute TikTok video that talks about reparations in an incredibly informative way. So utilize the resources that already exist, especially if you're coming at this with few resources. You have to figure out how to marshal the resources that exist out there, because there's a ton of them. So that would be my recommendation.
Can I add 30 seconds onto that? So of the 1,100-page report, 500 deals with history and how we got where we are today. And 13 chapters begins with enslavement. And the next chapter is racial terror and how the social structure was enforced. Third chapter is on political disenfranchisement. Again, how things were created and then made enforceable. And the fourth chapter is segregation, because once you can dictate where people live and what they could do, then everything else flows from that, whether it's healthcare, policing, education, all of the outcomes that folks on this call are very familiar with. And so each chapter begins with what happened on the national scene, and it contains the latest scholarship within the last 5 years of this history that's now just recently being unburied, whether it's Providence, Rhode Island, or Tulsa, or Chicago, or California. And then it ends with, what California's role in this is. But every locale has its own tale to tell on this sad, tragic story that can be augmented onto each of these chapters. No one is exempt, no one is clean in this national nightmare. So in terms of developing the political will to move locales along, yes, I agree that the task force report is a great starting place, and it's all available online. And because the history has been it's so buried that all of us on the task force, we thought we knew something about American history. We all thought we were pretty well read, but everybody learned something, and that will be true for every jurisdiction across the country. So that's a good starting place to begin to move the needle of public opinion.
Thank you so much. So we talked about nationally, but there's also the international perspective. So one of our questions was, I'm happy to see that ART is doing UN advocacy and using UN principles. As a transitional justice expert and UN independent expert, I find this encouraging. My question is, will UN engagement be an opportunity for direct cross-pollination with experts and activists in other countries that have already started large-scale repatriation processes after atrocities? In particular, I'm thinking of processes in the global South like Colombia. And just to let you all know, we have 5 minutes left. So that was a heavy question for having 5 minutes left. But if you care to answer, please try to keep this portion brief.
Yeah, so super quick. There's that old saying, think global, act local, and that applies for reparations. The work that's happening in California is in fact connected to the work that's happening nationally and internationally. And in fact, 2 task force members, myself and Lisa Holder, went to Geneva to present about reparations at the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent United Nations meeting. There have been a number of meetings I've attended at the international level about reparations happening on the, with respect to the continent of Africa, to Black folk in the diaspora, including multiple areas of South America. And so that work is in progress and it's going to continue. I think that we do need to understand how we can support each other's work.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to add on to that? All right. I was trying to find a question that would not take so much time to answer, but since we just have a few minutes left, I think it would be good to move on to closing remarks. And we're sorry that we couldn't get to all questions, but it's like 62 questions in here and we never are able to answer them all. But we thank you all for participating. And I'm certain that most of the questions in the chat can be answered by reviewing the California Reparations Task Force's report and also the California Legislative Black Caucus's 14 10-point reparations initiative that they're moving forward. So if we would
And
like
we
to,
also want to encourage people to save the chat, and also a recording of this thought series will in fact be available, so you can go back and listen at your leisure. So going, Jamie, we're talking about closing remarks.
yes, so if we could move on to closing remarks, that would be great. Who would like to go first?
I'll simply say that the idea of reparations is even more concrete and achievable now than it has ever been before. There's not a clear-cut path, and it's not an all or none on any particular issue. And I think that one of the things that will be important in our success in pursuing reparations is being able to work together across differences of perspective and opinion, and that truth matters. Name calling does not advance the process, but actually doing our due diligence and putting forth our arguments and the case that we have for our different positions is important. We don't need to 100% agree on anything. In fact, that stifles creativity, but we do need to be principled in our process.
Lisa?
I will just say that, if you are someone who believes in inclusive democracy, who believes that America should be a multiracial, inclusive democracy that gives opportunity to all people, then you are a reparationist. Because for the last 400 years, the experiment in this country has been to exclude most people, especially Black people and Native American people, for the benefit of a very few. And the work that we are doing in reparations is to repair the harm of exclusionism. And so if you believe that this country should adhere to the ideals of inclusive, multiracial democracy, then come on board because you believe in reparations.
I'll just follow up with what Dr. Grills had said. The task force recommendations, all 115 at the very end, of course, we had disagreements in and among task force members, but the 115 recommendations were unanimously approved, supported. As far as ART's position on it is that we support all of the recommendations of the task force. The devil is in the details, of course, and how things get worked out, but there's plenty of room for coalitions to be built and agreements to be made. And I'm not just talking about one specific, population. I'm talking about other groups specifically who are not Black, but should be involved in this fight. So just want to thank Nkechi and Jessica for putting on this program.
Thank you all so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation. Trust me, emails and phone calls have been blowing up about what is going on in California, what's happening in California. We say, okay, listen, we know that this is a very important conversation. All eyes are on the incredible work that you all are doing, and we just greatly appreciate you all taking the time today to talk about this with us. We want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. As Nkechi said, there will be a recording. It's going to be sent out to everyone that RSVP'd, whether or not folks joined. You will get the link either way. And please be on the lookout. We put it in the chat for Reparations from Concept to Reality. It's available on YouTube. It is an informative video. It's only 6 minutes, but it has so much information on there for you to learn about reparations and use it for a tool for education. And that is a powerful tool created by Nkechi Taifa from the Reparation Education Project. Nkechi, did you have anything closing you wanted to say?
No, that's good. You summed it up. Thank you.
All right.
And thank you to our panelists. Really, thank you. This hot button issue, and you all nailed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great Monday, everyone.